The Ultima Universe is a strange set piece in video game history. Originally conceived by the massive nerd himself, dubbed Lord British, Richard Garriott created a series of games called Ultima on various platforms like the PC, the Nintendo Entertainment System, and the PlayStation. Eventually, his ambition grew to have his creation be experienced by thousands and thousands of players all at the same time. This led to the eventual creation of what could arguably be the first MMORPG in history, Ultima Online. Ultima Online was one of the pinnacle online games back in 1997 upon its release. The game is still playable to this day, 24 years later. It eventually took a backseat to the online landscape when EverQuest hit the scene in 1999, but back in 1997, the idea of even playing a multiplayer game with other people across the globe was just mind-blowing. Richard Garriott would eventually leave the company he created Ultima with and would go on to other projects. Over the course of his gaming history, he would helm the development or production of several projects, including some failed MMORPGs like Tabula Rasa. In 2009, he formed the company Portalarium and began development on a spiritual successor to the first MMORPG, the subject of today's video, Shroud of the Avatar: Forsaken Virtues. Shroud of the Avatar began as more or less Ultima Online 2. Eventually, the game launched a Kickstarter campaign in 2013, with an early access version hitting Steam in 2014. The game fully released in 2018, and boy oh boy, has the game had a ton of ups and downs. I won't go into detail about its history, but more or less, it's a game that has had issues delivering on several of its promises. Instead, I want to talk about the game itself and how it's played in its current year of production. For starters, the game has been largely dismissed by the MMORPG landscape it set out to become a part of. Whether it was broken promises or just general dislike of where the game was going in its development, much of the crowd that backed the game either left or became bitter at its developers. But what about new players like me, who wasn't there during its initial development phases? Well, looking at Steam charts, the player base isn't the greatest, having peaks of around 100 players or lower currently. There is also barely any YouTube coverage of the game, so it's incredibly hard for those looking for information on it to get any opinions that are recent or even accurate. Well, I've been playing the game for about 2 weeks now, clocking in about 100 hours.
Loser! You're a loser!
After experiencing a lot of what the game had to offer, is it worth checking out? Or is the negativity surrounding the game justified? Well, let's see if you should play Shroud of the Avatar: Forsaken Virtues.
This world and its struggle is where you want to be. And you felt for the first time the pull of your destiny.
The story of Shroud of the Avatar is kind of still being developed. I know, weird to say.
You know, I'm lucky enough to be one of the very first people ever to develop games, much less role-playing games, starting in the 70s.
Brother, this guy stinks!
Anyways, more or less what is here in the main storyline quest, as well as pieces of lore you will find in the world, is that there is a dark force that has invaded New Britannia, and it's up to you, the Avatar, to find out what is going on. Obviously, you play as this Avatar, which is essentially a play on the definition of Avatar, meaning an icon or figure representing a particular person in video games, mainly you as the player. In this universe, there is apparently many avatars as well, which explains the MMO portion of the storyline, and that even though you are foreign to the world of New Britannia, it was prophesized that the avatars would arrive in this world and shape destiny. The storyline played by you also has several different outcomes based on your choices during certain quests. For example, you may come across a task in your adventure where you need to obtain an item from someone. Do you use diplomacy to talk your way into obtaining that item, or do you simply kill the person to get it? The choices aren't necessarily incredibly impactful in the storyline, but it is cool to see that there is at least some semblance of choice during quests, which influence your virtue alignment, which is a hidden statistic between love, courage, and truth. I assume they plan to add the other virtues in the game eventually, since the storyline mentions many other virtues, but at the time of this video there is only the 3, and for the most part, it affects very little. Shroud, otherwise known as SOTA or SOTA, can be summarized as an open-ended sandbox MMORPG. The game also has a single-player offline mode you can play, but honestly, the game is best played with other players. The game begins with a character creator where you will choose your character's gender, look, and name. The character creation in SOTA isn't anything amazing, but it does at least offer various different sliders, hairstyles, and looks to customize your avatar. Once you create your look, choose your name, and log in, you are greeted with a rather uninteresting tutorial. The tutorial tries its best to teach you the game mechanics, as well as introducing you to the starting storyline quest, but I will have to admit that it really is a poor way to grip new players. The combat, character progression, and quest mechanics are laid very thinly in the opening tutorial, and I wouldn't be surprised if it turned away a lot of potential players just because of how bad its presentation is, but I will have to say it does at least get better. Circling back to the sandbox description for SOTA, the game has a weird implementation of instanced areas and open world. So the game has a huge world map, sort of like a single player RPG, which is actually a pretty neat concept for an MMORPG. On the world map are various little areas you can go to called scenes. Entering a scene will bring you to an open world area, which in some cases can be pretty huge. The world map is unfortunately littered with tons of player-owned towns and such, but you get used to it. Since the tutorial doesn't really explain most of these features very well, I'll break down what's introduced. Combat in Shroud is a tab target system similar to what we've seen in major MMOs like World of Warcraft and SWTOR. Obviously, this system is simple. Left click or press tab to target an enemy, get within range, and you'll start auto-attacking them with your chosen weapon. Your spells down below can be used as long as you have the focus points available to cast them, and when used, will initiate a global cooldown. What the game's tutorial doesn't tell you is that later on you can do things like charge abilities to get better effects from them, as well as having a completely different advanced combat system in its deck combat mode. More on that later. You'll quickly learn in the tutorial quest that questing in Shroud is very old school. Basically, there is no hand-holding here in this game. Your quest log will give very vague summarizations of what you need to do to proceed the given quest. Usually you will need to, and I can't emphasize this enough, read and pay attention to NPC dialogue interactions to gather information on what you need to do next to advance quests. There is sometimes map markers that will show you where you may need to go if you track the quest, but sometimes it's not as easy as finding specifically a person to talk to or something to collect. This can be sort of jarring if you are used to quests in other games simply pointing you in the direction of where to go, but remember, RuneScape has a similar quest system where you aren't inherently told where to go and what to do. You have to read NPC dialogue to find out what to do. It's just usually there are guides for each and every quest, so it doesn't seem so challenging. Besides questing and combat, obviously there is progression, which comes in the form of skills, crafting, and gear. Shroud doesn't have a class system.
What's a paladin?
Isn't that the last name of the guy who shot Harambe?
Instead, you have choices of various skill trees that will provide attacks, buffs, magical spells, pets, and utility bonuses. The skills are split into two types, adventuring and crafting. The skills are then further divided by subtype. In the adventure path, the combat skill trees are blade, polearm, bludgeon, ranged, light armor, heavy armor, and shield. The magic skill trees are sun, earth, life, water, lunar, air, death, fire, and chaos. Lastly, the strategy skill trees are tactics, focus, bard, subterfuge, and taming. The second type of skills is the previously mentioned crafting. Crafting is divided into the gathering skills consisting of mining, forestry, fishing, field dressing, and foraging skill trees. Refining has the smelting, milling, textiles, agriculture, tanning, and butchery skill trees, with the last group being production. Production has the blacksmithing, carpentry, tailoring, alchemy, and cooking skill trees. Now, if that's not enough, it goes even further. Each skill tree has skill nodes that indicates specific things like an active attack skill, a spell, a passive ability, etc. Each node can also be separately leveled up, with no cap level. cycle, meaning that if you play the game enough, you can level infinitely. Now, obviously, it does hit a soft cap where it becomes really hard to level up a skill past a certain point, but the fact is, you can keep improving your character with enough dedication. When looking at your skill trees as well, you can see the total amount of levels you have gained in that specific tree. This benefits the magic trees, since the more levels you have in a specific magic school, the more attuned you become in it, which will gradually increase that magic school's effectiveness for you. Now, all of this probably sounds overwhelming, but wait, it gets better.
Don't bust that nut yet.
So you would probably assume just using the skill will increase its level. Well, that's only half right. The way you level up your skills is by gaining experience through activities like killing enemies, questing, or harvesting resources. Your experience gained then goes into a pool, which is split into adventure or crafting. You gain adventure experience through fighting enemies, you gain crafting experience by, well, crafting or harvesting resources, and questing will grant you experience to both groups. The pool experience is then spent whenever you do said skill or activity. So for example, let's say I want to level up my water magic spell, Ice Fist. First, I would gain adventure experience so I have a decent amount of pooled experience, and then I would simply use the spell to level it up. The more I use it, the more it will increase over time. Then even further, there is your individual adventure and crafting levels, which increase when you hit certain milestones in total experience, which also increases certain parameters ever so slightly. So, did you get that? Simple, right?
I'm so damn confused.
Trust me, it sounds complicated, but it's actually not too bad, and it's incredibly fun just theory crafting different builds and synergies based on what skills you choose to train, which then leads to even more depth in combat with the deck combat system. The deck combat system, or whatever you want to call it, is a more in-depth combat mode that you can switch to and use at any time. So it's not something that the game forces on you. You can completely ignore it if you don't want to use it. Anyways, it works sort of like a dual specking mechanic from other MMORPGs where you can switch builds on the fly. But this system actually affects how you interact with combat. You see, each spell and ability you learn can be slotted into a certain build you have. For instance, I have a build called Water Tank. In the menu here, I can assign a set equipment to switch to when I switch to this build, so I don't have to fumble through my menu trying to find everything. It also sets what spells I will have access to in my action bar, as well as rolling spells that change out automatically as time passes. See, as I go into combat, the spells will slide up into position, meaning that skill is available to use. As I cast and use abilities during combat, they will change out to different ones I allot into the slots, constantly changing how I approach combat situations. I can even stack spells that duplicate to increase damage and effects when doing so, rewarding me for quick action. I really like this combat mode, and I'm surprised it's not talked about more in the reviews for this game, since it really does put a nice little spin on tab target combat. Oh, and one last thing, there is also a combo mechanic within this combat mode, allowing you to mix two different abilities into one. For example, there is a spell called Soothing Rain, which is a heal over time spell. Well, you can mix that spell with another spell called Banish Undead. If you mix those two spells together, you create Cleansing Rain, which heals you over time, but also damages any undead enemies within your area. A neat extra feature within the Shroud's advanced combat system. But enough about all of that for now. Finally, once all the skills and experience and all of that is figured out, you then have your equipment. Your equipment starting out will be incredibly basic, but as you level up your crafting, you can begin to customize the weapons and armor you make, adding additional stats and enchantments to them to fully customize a set of gear that is to your playstyle. Essentially, the system is designed to have the best equipment in the game be player-made versus drops that are found on enemies. But don't worry, there is loot you can obtain from bosses and such that get close to some of the equipment you can craft, so if you aren't much of a crafter, you can either get some drops or just simply buy them from other players once they make it for you, which leads into some of the other features in this game and was actually one of the highest defining features that was highlighted when this game was being released. The player-owned housing housing and town system. Player-owned housing is nothing new to the MMORPG genre, but Shroud takes it to a really detailed level. Just about any item you obtain and is in your inventory can be set on your player housing area for decoration, with many items also being craftable. The amount of detail in the system is actually quite impressive. You can even purchase a player-owned town where you can run your own city. Unfortunately, it's not quite as cool as it sounds though. We will get to that when we get to the cash shop. Besides player-owned housing, there is also some PvP in the game. PvP in Shroud isn't a main focus, but there is some content here for the PvP lovers. You have battlegrounds and arenas, open world PvP in specific areas, a bounty loot system when you kill a player, and a pickpocketing skill that allows you to actually steal items from a player if you have the skill and you are in a PvP area. PvP, more or less like any game, will stress your knowledge on skills in combat within the game. In Shroud though, a lot of it can be chalked up to playing the right build, since some of the skills are arguably overpowered in PvP situations. The developers are trying to balance out skill trees, but PvP wasn't initially their main focus, so I doubt true balance will ever be achieved, but at least there is PvP content within the game. Endgame in SOTA is kind of open-ended as well. It basically boils down to continuing to increase your skills, crafting better items and equipment, or PvP. There is highly difficult areas to explore where enemies will be incredibly tough and require a full party to take out, but it's mostly for experience farming or resource gathering. The game is begging for something like a proper raid to experience that has its own spin on the idea of the generic endgame dungeon. Who knows though, there is a lot of hidden content in the game that players have yet to discover from what I've read. Things like hidden dungeons and bosses do exist within Shroud, so maybe it just hasn't been discovered yet. The community in this game is probably some of the nicest people I've ever met. Almost everyone in this game is willing to help out new players, whether by explaining certain things about the game, giving them items, or just being a welcome player base. Typically, they also hold events that will bring the community together, so it really is a very welcoming experience. Last couple things of note would be the graphics, art, and music department. The graphics for Shroud is actually surprisingly good. Some of the areas look outstanding, but I could definitely tell that the textures already had signs of aging, since the game came out quite a while ago at this point. So while the graphics are rather good, they aren't the best by today's standards. Also, much of the environmental design has a lot to be desired. Things like shrubbery or even pools of water don't interact with the player model as you move through it, unfortunately, which can be a bit of an immersion breaker. Music is also a bit of a letdown. As you play, you will most likely only hear the same 2 or 3 background tracks playing until you venture out to the other areas of the game. A bit of a shame, considering you would think that this game would at least have a full score of songs to play for anyone who gives it a shot, but sadly, most of its music seems to be hidden away. I guess it's probably time to talk about the game's monetization. Well, Shroud is a free-to-play game with a cash shop. Currently, there is an expansion called Episode 2 that unlocks a specific area of the game, as well as the highest leveled content. The cash shop contains various cosmetics, mounts, pets, XP boosts, and convenience items, nothing pay to win. The cash shop currency, called Crowns of Obsidian, or abbreviated as Kotos by the community, is about $10 for 1,000 of them. Most items of note in the cash shop will typically run you about $15 to $20. Not too bad, considering that's about how it will be in other games, and just about everything in the cash shop is permanent and tradable. Arguably, the best deal is their subscription. For $9 a month, you get 900 crowns, monthly free cash shop items, convenience items, and loyalty titles for staying subscribed. Not a bad deal, considering you are going to pay about that much for $9 worth of crowns anyways. The big kick in the nuts of this cash shop that most people spit their water over is the housing and plots you can buy. A fancy house in the cash shop can run as high as $200, a huge amount to ask from a player considering it's something completely optional and you can even earn a free house in-game by just playing the storyline. Sure, it's not as fancy as one that you can spend $200 on to get, but it's just an oddly huge number to ask of your player base. If you think that's crazy though, the player-owned towns are even worse. The most expensive town plot is $500. No joke there, it is a $500 cash shop item in a video game. Hard to believe. Now I have to be completely fair here. None of the cash shop items in the cash shop are needed. There is literally no advantage to anything in the cash shop that you can't already earn. Hell, you can even get the cash shop currency as drops from enemies, so theoretically, you could just farm cash shop items if you wanted to. The main concern people have is how expensive the player-owned houses are and the towns. Originally, the concept was supposed to be that the houses in towns were for backers during their Kickstarter project. Once the game released, they basically carried over those high dollar purchases and stuck them into their cash shop. The expensive ass town lots are also meant to be an expense that a group of people are supposed to buy into. For example, a large group looking to have a guild town or something like that. If you have a guild of say 20 people and you want to own a town, $500 divided by 20 suddenly becomes a bit more bearable. Still, it doesn't change that it does look somewhat bad having such a high price tag on a digital good, but at the end of the day, it's completely skippable. Alright ladies and gents, in summary, Shroud has some cool things going for it, and some major drawbacks. It's a mixed bag, but is it a mixed bag that deserves to be immediately dismissed based on its history? I think it's been unfairly stained by its past. Coming in as a new player, I can appreciate certain things the game is going for, like its retro feel, its attempt at emphasizing community and social interaction, as well as genuinely trying to do things a little differently. Does it do all that it tries well though? Absolutely not, but it's not the dumpster fire that everyone seems to think it is. I say it's worth at least trying the game since it's free. Let's move on to my final thoughts here. The game is free to play with a large amount of its content completely open to free players. The only content that is locked off is Episode 2, the expansion, and even that is only $20 to pick up and add to your account. Shroud of the Avatar has a very fun skill system similar to the old ability level up mechanics in FlyFF, where using abilities over and over again would level them up. This feature has a large potential for just theory crafting tons of different builds, as well as just being able to play everything you want with enough efforts and dedication since there is no cap on progress. The game has an incredibly friendly community that will welcome new players with open arms. They will teach new players all you need to know about the game, and even start you out with some equipment or tips on how to get deeper into the journey. The PvP content in this game has a lot of potential to grow and become a major part of the experience, and there is quite a decent amount of it in the game. From dedicated PvP maps to battlegrounds, there was quite a surprising amount of PvP in the game, more so than I was expecting to see. If you like life skills in MMORPGs, Shroud has a very rewarding life skill aspect to the game where you can make a very good amount of progress by just sticking to crafting and gathering. The player-owned housing system is pretty impressive with how much you can do with it. Literally almost any item you find can be placed and used to decorate your home, so if you like social life sim features like that in MMOs, Shroud has it. Lastly, the devs pretty regularly hop onto the game and talk to the community. They are largely open to feedback and criticism from the players, which is great to see from a company that is just trying to make a game that is fun for their niche community. The cash shop has some outrageous prices on some of the items. Cosmetics can run upwards of up to $15, and of course the previously mentioned premium houses can run all the way up to hundreds. Player-owned towns have the highest price I've ever seen in an MMORPG, and while I understand that all of this is completely optional or meant for groups of players to pitch in to purchase, it's a bit of a turnoff to people who see those prices. The game lacks a lot of polish. I mean a lot. Enemies will often get stuck stuck in animation, sounds will not play properly, some skills don't work in certain situations, sometimes quests won't work correctly. Overall, there is a ton of bugs in the game in addition to the environments and overall game experience feeling a bit like it's still in beta. The game's tutorial is downright terrible if I'm being honest. The set piece is just a bad way of introducing players into the game. Add cutscenes, more tooltips, maybe a more interactive environment, something that will grip new players, because the way it is now, the tutorial is definitely one of the game's biggest blemishes. SOTA at its heart is a retro old school MMO. The game is grindy, has zero to no handholding, and is difficult at times. It's meant to be that way though, just like early MMOs. If you don't like that sort of experience, then SOTA is not going to be the game for you. The world map and area scenes are a bit of a mess once you really look into it, especially as a new player. Seeing towns scattered all over the place with little rhyme or reason, as well as most of these towns just having inconsistent levels of quality design since they are made by players, isn't the best look for a new player coming across them. Not to mention, since most areas are instanced, it's a bit of a weird mechanic to get used to, since some maps will be completely open for players to join each other in, while some are completely privatized. Real-world item trading is a big issue with this game. I mean, I guess ironically that means you could potentially make money playing this game if you put enough time into it and make a market for yourself, but genuinely things like that is going to be generally frowned upon in the MMO community. And for the most part, the development team is aware of the trading, they just kinda turn a blind eye to it, unfortunately. Lastly, the game does have some level of drama behind the scenes with some of the veterans of the game and the development team. I don't know the full story there, so I can't really comment much further on it, but it is something that you can find on YouTube or the forums. In summary, as a new player looking to play the game for a decent amount of time, it can be worrying to read about some of the ordeals that the development team has had to go through with said drama. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is my full analysis of Shroud of the Avatar. Like I said, it's not a bad game, it's just not amazing either, which is probably why it's been largely ignored. Nowadays, if a game doesn't come out the game firing on all cylinders with perfection, it will get completely demolished. I think Shroud is at least worth a try if everything I discussed here is even remotely interesting to you. And you can look past its flaws, of course. Plus, the game takes place somewhere in the Ultima Universe, at least in spirit. I learned about Ultima from one OG YouTuber back in the day, and at least I can finally say I played one of those titles. Here's to you, Spoonie.
Betrayal! Betrayal!